you a part of one if these times do not work. We're in a series at the moment called Faith for Living. One of the things that I am always concerned about is when we talk about faith, what do we mean? By the way, as we talk about faith, I just want to be very clear to you. There is not a person today in this world who does not have faith. Now, I'm not saying they have faith in God. Don't get me wrong. But we all have a faith. Faith is that thing that dictates to us how we live our life. How do we do things? What is actually important enough to me that I want to actually do something about it? We all have a faith. An atheist, by the way, has a faith. A humanist has a faith. There is no shortage of faith. The question is what is your faith, or who is it in? And as we've started going through the book of James is written to a group of people who had started to deal with troubles. They began to deal with problems. Now, just to hit a bit of background, so as we're going into this, you get the full picture of what James is saying. James is the very first book of the New Testament that is written. It is written about 15 years after Christ's resurrection. It is still at this time predominantly a Jewish, some at that time were calling it a cult. A Jewish cult because it was an off-branch of Judaism is the way that most of them still saw themselves. As James is writing this in about AD 45, the Apostle Paul, who begins to transform the church the way we understand it today, was just taking off on his very first missionary journey. All right, so we got this background. If you were writing the first book of the Bible, now I know James didn't understand he was writing the first book of the Christian Bible, but he was writing to a group of Christians who were beginning to struggle. If you were writing the first book and you were stopping to try to settle down the problems that were coming in, what would you write to a group of Christians? I always find this a fascinating thought because in my mind, I would be saying, hey, first thing we need to do is settle down some doctrinal ideas. Now, James doesn't start there. In fact, a lot of the doctrine that he deals with it's kind of not there. Paul's going to come into it later and begin to really settle the doctrinal issues out, but James is practical. Our Christian faith is supposed to be a practical faith. It is not some highball ideas out there that we are aiming to grasp. In fact, James brings them right down to reality where we as followers of Jesus can get a hold of them. And so James starts with a thing we all deal with. Hard times. My brothers and sisters, count it all joy when you go through various trials, knowing this, that the testing of your faith produces endurance. James, as he talks to us as followers, tells us something very important. Hard times are normal. They will come, and they are a part of our life. How you handle them will either strengthen your faith or it will cause a division in your faith. He begins to talk about, he moves on from there, and he begins to talk about the royal law, about the preferences and the prejudices that we all find ourselves facing. And he moves from the royal law and he moves that idea of prejudice into, hey, if you say you follow the royal law, which, by the way, we know what that is, to love our neighbor as ourselves, then you must learn how to do good towards others. Last week, he got real personal as he talks about faith being practical. He went to a place that is painful. He began to talk about the tongue. The tongue is a world of iniquity. Set on fire by hell. Okay, I didn't say that. That's what James says. Now, as he's talking about the tongue, and by the way, let's just be honest, most of the things that we turn around and regret are somehow usually related to the tongue. Something we said. Either in anger, either in a moment of sharing a prayer request, in the moment of, by the way, we're good Christians here. We don't gossip, okay? We only share good prayer requests here. But James deals with this idea that the tongue, gets us into so much problem, and if we can control the words we use, we could probably learn to control the rest of our actions. As he's talking about the tongue, now as we move farther, understand that James is going to begin to talk about wisdom today. And as he's talking about wisdom, this is connected in with the words we use. So this is not a separate thought. This is, in fact, a continuation of the thought we started last week. Now, I just want to ask you a question. How do you define a good Christian? What does a good person of faith look like to you? Depending upon who we ask and the age we ask it in, this question is going to look different. Now, I'm going to kind of let you in on knowing kind of partly how old I am, because when I was growing up, there were certain things that a good person of faith looked like. All right? So just bear with me. Some of you might remember these days. But a good person of faith, number one, you could spot them in a crowd because partly of the way they wore their hair, right? Men had, it was almost a military haircut. If you had a good, couldn't tell the difference between a Christian and a military guy half the time. But if you were a good Christian, you had if you were a man, you had a what kind of haircut? Short back and sides, off the collar and off the ears. Really? Okay, we wouldn't have said it, but we knew that those liberal, non-good Christians, they would wear the hair and it would touch the collars. I mean, you could tell a liberal or a non-good Christian because if their hair was touching their collars, you knew they were something wrong with them. If you were a woman and you were a good woman of faith, what would your hair look like? Long. Okay, some of you guys remember these days. You're from the South. You know what I'm talking about. It wasn't just the haircut, though, was it? If you showed up on a Sunday morning, what would you look like if you were a good person of faith? Suit and tie, if you were a guy. Now, if for some reason you just were an almost good Christian, you could maybe get away with a pair of dress slacks as long as you had a tie with your collared shirt. But whoa, if you had on a polo shirt, because that's kind of going a bit soft as a good Christian. If you were a woman, what would you wear to church if you were a good Christian? You wore a dress. What is up with pants and women? I mean, that's the way we grew up. If you were a pastor, you did not show up like this. Let me just say, you'd be fired on the spot. It wasn't just the way we dressed. It wasn't just our haircut. There were words we knew. If you walked into a church and you were a good Christian, you knew you could go up to another Christian and you would call, if it was a guy, you would call him brother so-and-so. And in fact, even when I came to church here, there were several, if you guys remember Brother C, and I still call him Brother C. Brother Morton, that's the only way I knew them. Sister Hazel. Because that's what was seen as a good Christian, a good person of faith. We knew other phrases. We knew phrases like when someone talked about asking Jesus into your heart, we knew what they meant, didn't we? When someone says, I'm a born-again believer, we knew exactly what they meant. When someone would stop and they would talk about, hey, I felt the Spirit today. They weren't talking about the pizza that they ate last night that had anchovies on it. We understood what they were talking about. We stopped and there were so many things. We understood that a good Christian didn't go to movies. In fact, when I was real young, my dad, as a good Christian, refused to have a TV in the house. Now, that did change over time as he began to backslide a little. And then he would watch the news and Wheel of Fortune. They were okay. But the style of music, there were things that as we look and as we talk today, we talk about a good person of faith. What does it look like? Today, we kind of think about a good person of faith as someone who comes in and he knows the right words. Now, we're not talking about words like brother and sister, but if they know words like sanctification, justification, propitiation, if they know about Calvinism and Arminianism, we're going, oh man, these must be good people of faith. Now, please understand this. When I talk about this, I am not downing our cultures. Every culture, every Christian culture, every church culture begins to build a culture that is the way they do church. But is that how we define a good person of faith? Does culture equal faith? And James was worried about this because 15 years after the resurrection of Jesus Christ, as the Christians spread out of Jerusalem and began to start up little Jesus community groups all over the area, there were cultures that were beginning to build. Now, most of the culture, as we read through the book of Acts, was sort of following a certain trend. They were beginning to meet on Sunday mornings. And they would begin to tell stories about Jesus. Now, why did they meet Sunday mornings? Well, because that was the day of the week that Jesus rose from the dead. There was nothing necessarily spiritual about it. Jesus did not say, and I will build my church on a Sunday morning. Okay, that's not what Jesus said. But the early community began to build a culture just like we have a culture here this morning. And they began to meet on a Sunday morning, and as they would begin to meet, we understand that sometimes they would sing a hymn. Sometimes they would sing one hymn at the end of a service. Sometimes they would have meals together. But they were beginning to build a culture, and the problem with them as they began to build a culture is that the culture began to replace purpose. They were telling the story of why Jesus came. They were telling the story that he died on a cross and that he rose again. The problem is they were even remembering the great stories and his command, you shall love your neighbor as yourself, you shall turn the other cheek. But the problem is that the culture had begun to overtake the purpose so that the things that he called us to were missed for the culture. And so as we get to James chapter 3, and he's talking about the tongue, he started last week and he says, and we didn't really look at this last week, but he starts and he says, be careful. Don't let there be too many teachers among you, for we know this, we all stumble or we all fall in many ways. And by the way, did you get the we all stumble or we all fall in many ways? And so as he continues on this week, he's continuing on with the idea of our tongues and the words we use. And so as he looks at this little church, these little churches, and he begins to look at their culture, and he's looking at them as they're beginning to use their cliches as brothers and sisters. And I don't know if they actually were doing this, but we know there was a culture that James was concerned about that was beginning to replace purpose. And he starts to grab at them and he pulls them back to life. And this morning, as we look at this passage, I want you to understand this, that James is not here. It's not supposed to be this criticism. It is, how do I grab you and pull you back to life so that we stop seeing faith as a culture and faith is more of a purpose. So we're going to start in James chapter 3, verse 13. He pulls us back to reality, and as he talks about our words, and he's kind of slapped us around a little bit saying, hey, think about the words you use. Be careful. Now, as he's talking about this, remember, he is still in that same mindset about the words we use and how we use them. So he could be talking about the cliches that we use as spiritual good Christians. And he says this in James chapter 3, verse 13. If you are wise and you understand God's ways, I love the next two words. Prove it. Now, be careful how we read this. He is not talking about how do we become followers of Jesus Christ. This is not about how do we go to heaven. This is not about how we get our sins forgiven. This is about how do we make our faith practical. How do you make the way you follow Jesus Christ? Remember, James is writing to people who are already followers of Jesus Christ. This is not the book of Romans where he's trying to explain salvation by faith through grace, or a book of Ephesians. He's simply sitting here going, hang on, you are people of faith. How do you make your faith real and practical? How is it more than just a culture, but how is your faith a purpose? So if you say you are wise, with your words, you say you are wise. You're claiming grand and great things. You're saying great speeches. You're telling the good stories of Jesus. You got all the cliches down. You know all the right words such as justification, sanctification, propitiation. I'm sure there's a bunch more we can put in here, but if you are wise and you say you have understanding in God's ways, prove it. Why does he say that? Because here's what we know. Though last week as we began to look at James as he dealt with our tongue, and James says it is so difficult to deal with our tongue, the reality is that most of us only rub shoulders how often a week? Hour, two. For those of you who are diehards and you come to small groups as well, maybe a third. For those of us who men who do coffee time, here's my plug for men doing coffee time Thursday morning at, I'd say 7, but we all know it really starts at 6:30. Okay, 7. I say 6:30, but I also know Bob get here earlier than that, so. What am I trying to say? It is easy for when you're only rubbing shoulders with someone for a couple hours a week to do what? To learn the cliches. To know the right words. When you sit here on a Sunday morning for 2 hours and we just see each other, we got all our nice clothes on, we've got our special cologne, perfume, we look good, we smell good, we're happy. And the trials and the problems that we all deal with the rest of the week, they're kind of out there. And we're in here and we're in a good mood. How do we act around each other? We can say all the right words, and while we're here, we all say, man, they are a good Christian. They know the right words. They say the right thing. And James is saying this, if you're wise and you understanding, all those things you're saying, it's got to prove itself from Sunday afternoon to Saturday night. Real faith is not about simply the words and the cliches we use when we're around each other for our 2 hours. In fact, that's what James was trying to deal with last week. It's not the words we use in that couple of minutes. It's our whole conversation of life. How does your faith stand up when you put the fire underneath it? In fact, James continues, and I want to continue this verse because we only just started it. He says this, if you are wise and understand God's ways, prove it by. Okay, there's more to this. What should it look like? By living an honorable life. This is Sunday afternoon, Saturday night. By doing good works with humility that comes from wisdom. In other words, that Christianity that we say we hold on to should change the rest of our life. Your faith should not be a Sunday morning only experience. It's not just about getting together and singing worship songs with Craig. I kind of like that title by the name. Sunday Morning with Craig. But that's not what faith is about. Faith is not about sitting and listening to some guy talk for 35, 40 minutes on a topic. These things should encourage us and push us and propel us farther, but that is not faith. Faith is what you are doing Sunday afternoon when you get out and you get in your car and you get into the traffic and people start cutting you off and driving through red lights, stealing your parking spot at Walmart. It just goes on, doesn't it? You guys deal with real life every day, and what we do here on a Sunday morning, this is not real life. This is a moment where we get together and we get to be cheerleaders and encourage each other and push each other and challenge each other, but this is not your faith. And James says, your faith should show itself not on Sunday morning alone, but by how you live an honorable life, by doing good works with humility that comes from wisdom. When I was in college, I worked for a guy, and I worked for him for a while. And my boss, he was a deacon in his church. Been there a long time. He had run his own company. He became a deacon in his church, in quite one of the churches in one of the hometowns I was from. And yet, can I say this? When I worked with him from Monday to Friday, he was the meanest guy I've ever worked with. I've worked with a lot of guys who did not claim faith, and this guy as a deacon, I was always surprised because how he treated his workers on Monday to Friday. You see, it's easy to have the right words on Sunday morning. But how we live Monday to Friday, Monday to Saturday, is where our faith comes into practice. That's where the purpose of our faith has value. James tells us real quick, and I'm going to have to move real fast. James says that our faith can be lived out in two ways. He says your faith can be lived out in two ways. Number one, he says this. I'm going to go down to James chapter 3, verses 14 and 15. He says this. Okay, your faith as a follower of Jesus Christ can be lived out in two ways. But if you are bitterly jealous and there is selfish ambition in your heart, don't cover up the truth by boasting and lying. For jealousy and selfishness are not God's kind of wisdom. Such things are earthly. They're unspiritual. They're demonic. Let me just put it this way. James is talking to believers, not unbelievers. James is saying there is a normal way to live life, the way that everybody outside who do not claim to be Christians live. And how do they live? They live for themselves. James says it's not about the words you use. For if you live, you say you have the right words, you say you believe in God, you say you believe in the royal law, you say you believe Jesus died for our sins, and yet you continue to act and do and live a certain way, this is just the way everybody else lives. And if you're a follower of Jesus Christ, this is earthly. By the way, when he says earthly, he means this is normal, what normal people live like. This is unspiritual. In other words, they don't claim to have a connection with God. And if they don't have a connection with God, then they are what? If your father is not God, Jesus is, and your father must be the devil. So what he's saying is basically this. If you say one thing and you live a different way, you're living like everybody else. And as a follower of Jesus Christ, guess what? We can live that way. If you want to know more of what we're talking about, my shameless plug for Tuesday night, 6:30, we're going to delve into this a little bit more. Where Paul says that as a follower of Jesus Christ, there's a new nature and there's an old nature. James is dealing with this idea. You can live that old way of life. That's the way you used to live. But there's a better way. There's a second way. And James begins to look at this, and he says this in James chapter 3, verse 17, that there's a wisdom or there's a way of living that is not simply about talking good talk on a Sunday morning. Here's how he says it. But the wisdom from above is first of all pure. It is peace-loving, gentle at all times, willing to yield to others. It is full of mercy and the fruit of good deeds. It shows no favoritism and is always sincere. In other words, James is saying this way of life does not start with self and end with self. And by the way, if you want to know where James got this teaching from, he got it from Jesus. Jesus said this in Matthew chapter 16, verse 24. Then Jesus said to his disciples, if any of you want to be my follower, then you must give up your own way, take up your cross, and follow me. In other way, Jesus is saying, my followers do not live a normal life. What is seen as normal, that is promoted as normal, is not the way we promote it. In fact, he goes farther in Matthew chapter 20, verse 26. He says, but among you it will be different. Whoever wants to be a leader must be your servant. This kind of living that we're called to is pure, peaceful, gentle, one that is willing to yield. And by the way, this is not normal. You see, in the world we live in, we celebrate selfish ambition. If you want to get ahead at your job, what are you encouraged to do? Think about yourself. We promote this idea that, well, because this is a dog-eat-dog world, if you're going to get ahead in life, you're going to have to do what? And by the way, we accept jealousy as something that is okay. Because jealousy tells us and shows us what we're missing, and if we're missing something, jealousy pushes us forward to achieve and get what someone else has. It's okay. Greed is good, right? I mean, that's the idea. Can I say this? We all find ourselves not wanting to work for that guy. And some of you guys have worked for this guy. Nor do you want to live beside this guy, nor do you want your child to marry this guy or woman. But on the other hand, we promote it like today, like this is something to be achieved. And we kind of put some of these guys on pedestals and go, woo, look at him, look at him. And James is saying, if you are a follower of Jesus Christ, shame on you. That is not what we've been called to. A faith that will sustain you is something that is going to have to be able to hold you up when life falls apart. And by the way, life will fall apart. You've all have probably been there a time or two in your life when you've had to re-put the pieces of your life back together, and it is your faith which should help you do it. If your faith is stopping and kind of creating more fighting, more division, you might want to look at it and examine it. Because our faith should help us find strength when the hard times come. Our faith should help us to control our tongue when fighting wants to come out. Our faith should help us do good when I want to do good for myself. How do we do it? By the way, it's easy to talk about this, isn't it? We're in church. We're all good Christians here. We're all people of faith. And so we stop and say, yeah, this sounds good. How do we do it? You see, the reality is that all of us find ourselves at time wrestling with this problem. James is writing to all of us. In fact, if you missed that part, for we all stumble in many ways, he said that at the beginning. Be careful because we all struggle. James is dealing with this reality that even those of us who are dedicated followers of Jesus Christ, who want to follow him with all of our heart, we still have days where we battle this. So how do we do it? Well, I just want to kind of pull back as we get ready to close. Let's go back to James chapter 1. We already kind of skipped over this because of our time on that Sunday. But as James was talking about trials, James made a comment that helps us to be able to get a grasp on marrying up our Sunday morning talk with our Wednesday afternoon slump. In James chapter 1, verse 5, he says this: if you need wisdom, if you are struggling, ask our generous God, and he will give it to you. For he does not rebuke you for asking. In other words, James is looking at us saying, if we're going to get to this way of living, it has to come to a point and a place where we say, God, not the way I want to live, but how do you call me to live? Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane, as he was about to go to a cross, made this very same statement where he said, Father, not my will, but your will. Look, I want to just say this real quickly. As we talk about what does a good Christian look like, I want to go to just a point that I didn't make throughout all this. But James is not talking about us going around judging people Christian faith. Now, we know Jesus says, by their fruit you shall know them. But James is not telling us to go around and start looking at and judging, all right, are the works you're doing, are the words you're using, are you being preferential? How are you handling up to trials? What are you saying? What James is doing is he's looking at us saying, you need to look at your own life and see where you're at. Our goal is not to put up a piece of paper with a bunch of lines on it and say, do you measure up? That's not our responsibility. James is looking at us that we put the ruler in our own life and say, where am I at? Is the faith that I say I have, is it measuring up to what I say I am and I do? You see, what's going on in your heart, nobody can see but yourself. The faith that you have on a Sunday morning, I love it when we all get together and we have a good time together and we sing songs together. I love that. But the faith that you have here means very little if it doesn't change how you live Monday morning, Friday night, Saturday. Our talk and our walk should look like Jesus. So, as we close this morning, I just want to ask you a very personal question. How do we learn to close the gap between what we say we believe, all the good Christian talk that we do, and the way that we live Monday morning, Friday night? How do we close that gap? And if you find yourself sitting there saying, there's this battle that I do face, that I know what I should do, and I know what I'm called to do, but I can't do it, James makes this real practical statement. If you want to start closing the gap, start going to God in prayer. God, help me. Give me the wisdom. Give me the strength. Show me where I need to close that gap between what I say I am and how I live my life.